G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. March 2026, Sunday. Too good a day not to go for a bit of a ride. And we'll have a go at the 27th instalment in the Trumpocalypse Chronicles. It's about a month since I did a Trumpocalypse instalment, so that should be fun, eh? Okay, camera should be rolling. So for about the past 2 weeks, the United States and Israel have been conducting an undeclared war against Iran. They haven't got the blessing of the United Nations. Netanyahu and Trump are both arguably qualified for the title of international war criminals. Netanyahu for what he's ordered the Israeli Defence Forces to do in Gaza, and Trump for his habit of committing piracy and perfidy and murder on the high seas in the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. Congress hasn't authorised the war. It's really difficult to understand where America expects to benefit from its own activities. Although back when Obama was the president, Trump was warning that the president was likely to launch a military excursion or expedition into Iran because the president was no good at negotiating and he needed a distraction to get people's minds off his falling poles. Trump is certainly beset with falling poles. He's the most unpopular US president in the history of US presidency. And as we come up to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence at the conclusion of the War of Independence, it occurs to me that they've had riots on the streets. The immigration customs enforcement militia have been shooting citizens for daring to protest since midwinter. You know, it was below freezing on the streets when those people were out there complaining and being shot for their temerity in requesting that the law enforcement community protect them from the immigration and customs enforcement forces. And of course, they didn't get protected. But it was, as I said, very, very, very cold. Now we're only doing 44 kilometres an hour, so the wind noise on the helmet microphone shouldn't be too bad. I'm in economy, so I thought we might do a 52 kilometre round trip ride through Dundee, largely because I did a particularly good Trumpocalypse Chronicle instalment on this 52 kilometre track. Christmas Day 2024. And pretty much everything that I spoke of then, after Trump had won his second election and before he was inaugurated, has come to pass, with turbochargers glowing bright red and bells ringing and horns blaring. So I thought, yeah, it's rather a nice day for going for a ride. There's no wind to speak of. There's no clouds in the sky to make silly messes of the lighting on the lens. Pretty good opportunity to go for a ride on bitumen with the bike on economy setting and see how much current gets used. On the bike side of the ledger, I've recently been a little bit surprised to learn quite how much of a difference to the current usage, or, you know, in inverted commas, fuel consumption, dependent on the wind. And you'd think that on an out and return journey it wouldn't matter, because the headwind that resists going one way would be a tailwind that improves life coming back the other way. But it's not at all uncommon to get a headwind all the way to town and then find that you're riding through still air. So you get all the downsides and none of the upsides. Having an average day with maybe a 10 kilometre an hour wind from somewhere, if that's normal, then an absolutely still air day might improve your battery consumption by 5%, and it works the other way too. You can lose 5, 7, 10% to a cold day with a high wind. But anyway, plugging on into a headwind is something that the Americans are going to have a lot of in their future, and the consequences of what America has decided to do is going to make sure that an awful lot of other places are going to have difficulty too. Just one of the snippets I heard is that in Thailand it's been emergency decreed that you're not allowed to have your air conditioner set to cool the air to anything below 27 degrees Celsius, which is about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, in order to save electricity, because Thailand has no fossil fuel. All their electricity comes from fossil fuel power stations. Closing the Strait of Hormuz, okay, so 20% of the oil that's burnt in the world and 20% of the natural gas that's burnt in the world comes through the Straits of Hormuz. If you're frightened the underwriters pool in the shipping insurance industry, they stopped writing policies for anybody to go through the Straits of Hormuz, so no oil tankers go through. What that means is there are no empty oil tankers turning up at any of the oil refineries inside the Persian Gulf. And that means that once the product storage tank on shore beside the refinery is full, you have to switch off your refinery, because you can't keep producing refined transport fuel if you've got nowhere to store it, and you can't store it anywhere if you've got nowhere to unload your storage tanks. And if there's no ships coming to collect it, there's no way of unloading your storage tanks, so you shut your refinery down. And if you know what you're doing and you do it carefully, that's going to take days to a week to shut down totally. Once you get an oil refinery shut down, it might take you 3 months to crank it back up. So there's not going to be any kind of a hot running fast restart to the mess that Donald Darling Trump has set off by agreeing to Benjamin Netanyahu's assertion that Iran is only a year away or a month away or a week away from having an atom bomb. And wouldn't that be a terrible thing, because Israel's been annoying Iran since 1947 by most counts, and the Israelis are terribly afraid that if the Iranians got a bomb, then they would obviously use it on Israel. Why are they so terribly afraid of that? Because that's what they would do if they outnumbered the Iranians by 10 to 1, and the Iranians outnumbered the Israelis by 10 to 1, which is probably the only reason the Israelis have not yet used any one of their 120 nuclear warheads on Iran. That and the public relations effect of being the first one to use a nuke on one of your neighbours. But what you're looking at on a national scale, a Gestalt scale, a cultural, sociological scale, is lack of self-esteem, insecurity, fear and projection. Somebody who's got low self-esteem, somebody who's fearful, they imagine that everybody else is just like them. So they see the whole world as being just as driven by fear as they are. And just as they're absolutely certain that they would do whatever they could get away with if they were big enough and ugly enough and strong enough, they imagine that's how everybody else must be as well. No insight. Pure projection. As I was saying on the comments thread, one of the very first things that the Trump administration got around to doing, wow, 53, was to fire anybody in the Department of Defense or the Pentagon who was smarter than usual, better educated than usual, anybody who had strong moral convictions or a good grasp of what the Constitution meant, anybody who had experience in how things were properly done by the traditions of the service. They got rid of all of them. They got rid of most of the Judge Advocate Generals, the Inspectors General, anybody to whom the rank and file could appeal on matters of legal judgment. You know, excuse me, is this order I've been given lawful? Got rid of all that. And as that was seen to be happening, a whole bunch of people who had lots of moral scruples, who were maybe within 5 or 10 years of retiring after 20 or 30 years in service, they could see how much bullshit they were going to be expected to swallow every day in the future, stretching out at least till the end of the Trump administration. And they just put in their application for early retirement and got out. So everybody who actually knows what they're doing has died or retired or been fired. And all the, not even B-grade individuals, the C and D and E grades are marginal failures who were just barely scraping along and managing not to get kicked out every time they had a performance evaluation. That's all that's left. They've been re-enlisted and promoted. And according to the Peter principle, everybody gets promoted one level of responsibility above their actual ability to do the job. So the United States Army, Navy and Air Force chains of command is now absolutely bloody chock full of ambitious C-grade wannabes, all pretending to be vastly more efficient than they actually are, led by that drunken half-wit Pete Hegseth. Now, I can remember when people used to be maltreated by the police in America for having an American flag sewn on the back pocket of their jeans, because that meant they thought so little of America they wanted to sit on the American flag every time they sat down, and sit rhymes with shit. So they were effectively, figuratively shitting on the American flag when they sat down. It's actually against the Uniform Military Code of Justice to allow the US flag to touch the ground. It must be upheld. At all times, under all circumstances, you may not put a flag on the ground. In the military, it's an offence to dishonour it. Under the US Constitution, it is a freedom of speech right to burn it in a public place. If you want to do it, that's, you can do it. There have been court cases over it. I do not know what would happen if anybody took Pete Hegseth to court, asking to have him taken to task for having printed the United States flag on a handkerchief and keeping it in his top pocket ready to blow his snotty little nose on. I'd like to know how much worse than printing a flag on toilet paper and wiping your ass on the Old Glory, as they call it, the Stars and the Stripes. How much worse than wiping your ass on the Stars and Stripes would it be to blow your fucking nose on it like Hegseth is prepared to do? Every time you see the prick in a suit, he's got a flag tucked up in his top left pocket, ready to blow his fucking nose on. And it's Dunning-Kruger effect. He's too fucking stupid to know how stupid he is, and he thinks it's a power move to show that he cares so much about the flag that he's got the flag pointed on his snot rag. And that's who's in charge of the US Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines and their Coast Guard. I had an auntie who married an American. He came from Oneida on the Great Lakes, and she used to pretend that he was part Cherokee. I have a cousin who still doesn't speak to the memory of his mother on that account, because he grew up thinking it was all real. Then he got close enough in touch with his American relatives to discover that no, there's no known connection between the local reservation and his family. The bloody story one's grandmothers and mothers will tell one. "12 kilometres for only 8% of the battery." Still doing 46 on the level. This hill's going to slow it up a bit though. So anyway, the immediate effect of America and Israel starting to bomb Iran around here is that on the 5th of March I went to put some fuel in the Subaru. I had not done that since the 2nd of February. So over a month, the price of fuel went from $1.84 per litre, and for people who think in American freedom units, there are 3.85 litres to the American gallon. There's actually 4.45 litres to a proper imperial British gallon. A colonial gallon like we grew up using, well I grew up using. But anyway, went from $1.84 a litre to $2.26 a litre. And And because the price had gone up so fast, and all of that had been in the previous 3 days or a week, I think. The next time I went past the service station, I pulled in because I'd done about 30 kilometres, 35 kilometres, and it was $2.48 per litre. So it went up 40%, and then it went up another 10%. That's a bit rough. Awful lot of people whose ability to commute depends on burning petrol for an hour or so each way. They're going to have a terrible difficult time adjusting to that, and it's going to get worse. And everything that goes into anything, any spare parts, any consumables, they're all going to reflect the price of fuel. And because everything was fairly finely balanced the way it was, a 20% reduction in oil and gas supply is going to result in much more than a 20% increase in price. As I've just shown, we first had a 40% increase and then we had another 10% on top of that. And then there's the not so minor fact that a third of all the fertiliser that's used by every farmer in the world also travels through the Straits of Hormuz. So if you visualise cutting agricultural production by at least 30%, probably affecting the poorest farmers most because they're going to be least likely to be able to afford an increase in an input cost. There's a lot of businesses that have only just barely been hanging on that are probably going to find a great diminution in their trade. Their cash flow is going to drop off, their fixed overheads are going to stay the same, all their input costs are going to go up, and all their customers are fucking broke because everybody's in the same boat. And in the US, they've been building data centres as fast as they can so that their grid's going to be highly likely to fail. So they're going into the hot season, the summer of their discontent, 250 years after they've fought themselves free of taxation without representation and having a king in England. All the people who couldn't get into the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines or the Coast Guard because they were temperamentally unsuited, they weren't intelligent enough, they didn't have the manual dexterity or the skills, they weren't quick enough on their feet, they were overweight and unfit. Or they were just unwilling to keep the rules because the rules-based society works better than every other method anybody's ever tried. All those sort of people, they got jobs with ICE, which has been functioning pretty much like the Sturm Abteilung, or the SR. Not R as in R for Romeo, R as in AH, which is the German pronunciation of capital A. The brown shirts in Hitler's Germany, who were themselves a copy of the black shirts in Mussolini's Italy. Oh, I wonder if the Fox printed on video. I got to see a second side of it as it crossed the fence, but I'm pretty sure it was out of frame by then. .85% remaining, 16 kilometres down the track. So I sort of visualise some kind of an attempt to suppress voter turnout among anybody who's likely to vote Democrat in this November half-term election or by-election or whatever they bloody call it. I don't know whether Trump's going to be able to cite the fact that he's in a war that he hasn't had congressional permission to launch, and which his party don't seem able to make their mind up as to whether it's a war or a special military operation like the one the Kremlin mounted in Ukraine 4 years ago. They can't really call it a police action, and it seems that the American military has bombed the military installations on Karg Island, which is an Iranian island upon which there are a whole bunch of Iranian oil refineries and shipping terminals, and there's a whole lot of sort of anti-aircraft, anti-missile defences to protect all that infrastructure. The Americans are claiming to have wiped out the military installations on Karg Island. They're also under a lot of pressure from everybody in the world to put their money where their mouth is and open the Straits of Hormuz. Hegseth has literally faced the cameras and said, oh, the Straits of Hormuz are open, there's no obstacles to going through the Straits of Hormuz if only the Iranians would stop shooting at people. Yeah, great, Pete, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? The Straits of Hormuz are open if only the Iranians would just stop shooting at ships. So against that backdrop of Trump hoping that the Iranian regime is going to collapse under the weight of bombing, and that hasn't happened, there's a bunch of people who are betting that the next step is going to be for America to attempt to capture Karg Island and or militarily occupy the landscape adjoining the shoreline of the Straits of Hormuz in order to deny access to missile launch sites and cruise missile or drone launch sites. And that would require a hell of a lot of American boots on the ground, and golly gosh gee darn shucks, coincidentally the Americans have actually just ordered a ship called the Tripoli, the USS Tripoli, which is an amphibious landing support ship with a grand total of 5,400 personnel on board, 2,500 of whom are combat infantry marines. And they're on their way from the excited states to cross into the combat zone. Presumably they're going to have to show up in the Indian Ocean. I can't imagine that they're going to mount their bloody invasion from the Mediterranean, but who knows? It's the Hegseth Department of Defence. More or less anything's possible. 80%, 43 kilometres an hour, 19 kilometres out. So, anybody who's expecting a rapid solution to the disruption to international trade in oil and gas and fertiliser coming out of the Straits of Hormuz, I think they're going to be disappointed by development of events, the unfolding developments. And I guess I'm in the situation riding my solar-powered electric motorbike across the countryside, where quite literally 45 years ago I was watching Mad Max, the Road Warrior, And there was a character in that they called the Gyro Captain, and I thought he was a pretty cool dude if only he'd had an ultralight instead of a gyrocopter. And I must admit, a big part of the motivation to be living where I live, how I live, was the Gyro Captain in Mad Max 2. But they've repealed Air Navigation Order 95.10, so it's illegal for me to rebuild my ultralight and fly it with a motorbike motor and battery and charge controller, or otherwise I bloody well might be doing that. But to be honest, you can get an app to stick on your phone which compares your GPS location with the GPS corrected radar observed location of any aeroplane you can see in the sky, and you go to that app and it'll tell you the registration of the aeroplane, who it's owned by, where it took off from, and unless it's a military or police flight or it's gone dark for some reason or other, it'll tell you where it's going to. So if I was to stick a Talaria Sting motor and battery into my ultralight and go for a quiet little fly painted duck egg blue, I'd show up on their radar because it's all made out of aluminium pop riveted together, and the bastards would come and shoot me down. The way it is here, I get to wear my leather jacket, my helmet, glasses, my gloves, and go for a quiet little ride at 30 mile an hour airspeed around the countryside, and it's not illegal and no one comes and fucking hassles me for doing it. But how would you feel if you'd been preparing for World War III and the collapse of civilization for 40 or 50 years, missing out on all of the bright lights of the big city because you wanted to be in a better situation when the shit hit the fan? How would you feel if you got to now and nothing had gone wrong? I reckon you'd feel like a dickhead. But as it stands, the people who get to feel like a dickhead are the ones who got 3 mortgages and they're on their 4th failed marriage with a Brady bunch in the suburbs, commuting an hour and a half each way to get to work to earn the money to pay the tax and have enough left to pay their bills. But that's just my way of thinking. And I might be wrong. I think the people who said in the 1960s that a clever idea was to turn on, tune in and drop out, they had the rights of it. The people who thought it was a good idea to support the United States in whatever they wanted to do militarily, because after all, in 1942 America saved Australia from having to learn to speak Japanese, and that's why we went to Vietnam, and that's why we'd gone to Korea. And yeah, well, all those people now get to process the following pieces of information. While we were sucking up to the Americans, the Liberal National Government under Tony Abbott gave a 99-year lease on the Port of Darwin to the Chinese, even though Australia was expecting America to help defend Australia from the Chinese in the event that China and America ever went to war. So we're not really in the best of graces with the Americans when it comes to the Chinese. Then, also to curry favour with the Americans, we've allowed the Americans to rotate, I don't know whether it's 2,000 or 5,000 US combat troops through the Northern Territory to get them out from under the Chinese missile umbrella that would otherwise covered their bases in Guam and Okinawa. So they're using us as a safe place to put soldiers so they can get back in there after the base has been hit the first time. They're also using Australia as a really good place to refuel their B1s, their B2s, their B52s and their C-17s, supplying the American aircraft with fuel and consumables on Diego Garcia or Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean, which is a British administered island which has slowly been given back to the traditional owners. But to get to it, the Americans really like staging through Australia. And that means all of those American military jet aircraft are dependent on Australia's supplies of kerosene, aviation jet fuel, Jet A1, AV2, call it what you will. When the American Air Force comes to Australia, they expect Australians to have fuel on hand. But in about 1976 or 77, the Liberal Prime Minister Mal Fraser was convinced by his bean counters that it would be much, much, much cheaper and more efficient if the government were not responsible for the cost of maintaining bulk fuel storage. So they passed legislation outlawing any Australian local, state or federal government department owning and maintaining bulk fuel storage. So Australia depends for its bulk fuel storage on whatever storage tanks and trucks are maintained by the commercial petroleum producers, and they run a just-in-time delivery service which at any one time keeps somewhere between 21 and 29 days worth of petrol and diesel and kerosene on the continent of Australia at normal usage rates. And because we don't comply with the OECD requirement to have 90 days of refined transport fuel at normal rates stored within the national boundaries in order to cope with supply side shortages. Back when Barnaby Joyce was getting kicked out by his first missus for having a mistress that was pregnant, I wrote to him and suggested that, you know, something to take his mind off his domestic bullshit might be to get in touch with whoever it was that needed to build 90 days worth of storage for refined transport fuel and fill the fucking tanks up. And the best, my local member of Parliament, Barney Baby Joyce of the National Party back then, he's now a One Nation party, but back then he convinced my Prime Minister Scott Morrison to beg the Americans to get us out of this political mess. So Donald Trump gave him a receipt for a post-it note which was attached to the top left-hand corner of America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is crude oil stored in an underground salt mine in Texas. So that's where our Strategic Petroleum Reserve is, and in order to try and manipulate the market and keep the price of fuel down, the Trump administration has already sold off 50% of America's statutorily required Strategic Petroleum Reserve. All gone. Sold off already. By golly, hasn't Dundee grown up? Holy shit! That conglomeration on the left over there, that was not there last time I was here. I mean, yeah, I don't think that was 2 stories. Wow. Tree changes and refugees from rising sea level and global warming. Or One Nation white supremacists coming to Celtic country. Who knows? And now we'll have a fast kilometre. Along the highway. 71%. Doing 74 kilometres an hour. 78. 79. Across the wind going uphill. 80. I saw a movie called Tron about a bloke who was living inside a bloody pinball machine, riding around on an electric motorbike. That is a lot like what this feels like. To stay at 60, but now we're off the highway. I can go into economy mode and come back down something like 40. Now we used 5% of a battery for that. It went from 71 to 66%. But we're still only using 30 watt hours per kilometre. Now when I'm going to town on the highway at 65 clicks, I'm normally using about 50 to 60, depending on the wind. Yeah, so as I was saying, all them American military Harrier planes, when they come to Oz, they expect Oz to have the kerosene. And guess where Australia buys its kerosene? Chinese refineries. 2 days ago, China announced Beijing had ordered all refineries to stop selling their product and exporting it. So Australia just lost its supplier of Jet A1. That means shit oh dear for firefighting, because all the helicopters, all the air tankers and all the fire bombers, they all run on Jet A1. We are coming up to autumn, but if we have a dry winter and no fucking fuel, and then we go into a hot windy summer, or hot windy spring and a hot summer, we're just about going to get burnt into the Great Eastern Fire Break, which is the old joke about the what's a firefighter called the Pacific Ocean, the Great Eastern Fire Break. You go and stand up your armpits in it and watch the rest of the fucking country get burnt. So, alright, part one of the ambition was to be riding around on a fucking solar-powered electric vehicle. It's just the Third World War starts and everybody starts worrying about fuel. Well, we can tick that box, but the trouble is pretty soon when you get to town to buy the groceries, there's not going to be any, because all the groceries come to town in a truck that runs on diesel. All because Donald Trump didn't want anybody thinking about the increasing flow of revelations from the Epstein-Trump files, because there's more mentions of Trump in those files than there is of Epstein. There's more mentions of Trump in the bloody Epstein files than there is of Jesus in the Bible, according to people who do word searches. So the internet says. At least that's what they tell me. So what seems to be happening is that we're alive in time to watch the extreme end stage result of somebody who's started off fairly intelligent, but they've been raised by vicious, savagely selfish individuals, and their only example of success has been watching selfish people get their own way. So they've got no idea that any other way is possible. It's like they've grown up in an unremitting shithole, and therefore they're doomed to behave as turds for their whole bloody life. And Trump's a really good example. Rupert Murdoch's another really good example. They're aware of the concept of ethics and morality, but they think they're foolish fairy stories that are only believed in and subscribed to by idiots who don't understand that selfishness rules. Whereas as far as I've encountered, the best definition of sin or Satan, which a lot of people go on about a hell of a lot. They talk about this is sinful, that's a sin, that's Satan made me do some other thing. In the Book of God Theories that I place a fair bit of credit, I find it a credible explanation. It says the only true sin or Satan is selfishness. Why do the Israelis think it's a good idea to bomb all the Arabs in their neighbouring landscape? Because if the Arabs aren't there, then the Israelis will get to take over their land. It's selfishness. Somebody once asked a representative sample of Israelis, why are you people fighting against your neighbours? Oh, because I love my country, I love my family, I love my wife, my husband, my children, I love my culture, I love my city, I love my province, you know. All of them said they were fighting for love. And they were asked, why do you think your enemy fights? Oh, they only fight because they hate us. They just fight against us because they hate us, because they're bad people, and that's why they hate us, and they hate us, that's why they're bad people. Then they crossed the border and asked the Arabs, I don't know whether it was in Gaza or in Lebanon, you know, why do you fight against the Israelis? Oh, I fight to defend my country because I love my family, my city, my state, my culture, my way of life, my girlfriend, whatever. They love all of it. That's why they fight to defend. And why do you think your enemies fight against you? Oh, they only fight against us because they hate us. Both sides of them projecting the same bullshit onto each other. And all of them have been taught to think that way in infancy. And it's been reinforced all through their childhood. Some of them have gone off, received a religious education, and 1 hour of one day per week, they sit there and listen to somebody say all words to the effect, love your neighbour, don't be an arsehole. And then they go out there and the rest of the time they're absolutely flat out trying to buy whatever they want cheaper than anybody wants to sell it to them so they can get ahead. They want to sell whatever they're selling for the highest possible price they can get for it. They don't think there's anything wrong with the idea of finding an environmental surplus and harvesting everything and stripping the land back to bare rocks and leaving a desert behind them and taken the collected over-harvested surplus far away somewhere where nobody's got any of that stuff, and then selling it for the highest bloody price they can because nobody there's got the ability to go and collect it for himself. It's the exact opposite of the manna economy as described in the Bible. I'm drawn to the suspicion that 5,000 years ago there was a resistance against the broadacre death cult of harvest everythingism, which had arisen in southeastern Turkey 12,500 years ago at the end of the last ice age, when one tribe had nearly died of starvation. And that one bloody tribe partook the fruits of the tree of knowledge, the technology to harvest everything, and they turned the land around them into desert. And then they fucked off and stole somebody else's land and turned that to desert, pissed off again. They opened Pandora's box, and apparently out of Pandora's box there came all the evils of the world. And the very last thing to emerge from Pandora's box was hope. And the big hope has always been that the rest of humanity, all 3 billion of them when I started, now there's 8.2 billion of them, but the big hope was all of them would wake up to themselves and decide to cooperate. To live on the minimum possible resources. To do what they could, or what we can, to repair the tattered, battered, shattered, smoking fucking ruin that our ancestors left us of what was once upon a time a really wonderfully, incredibly complicated, interconnected ecology and biosphere. Before some fucking selfish arsehole come along and wanted to simplify the biosphere so as to grow a single artificial crop to be over-harvested and taken to market. And they wanted to increase their yield, wanted to grow more wheat, wanted to grow more wool, wanted to grow more meat, more. Around here, people used to keep their own population at a stable level such that when there was a 10-year drought, nobody died of thirst or starvation because there weren't too many people. The Europeans, the landless, ignorant peasant who comes from Europe, European, their idea is to breed up as many people as they possibly can, constantly on the fucking edge of starvation through unemployment, and whenever there's a bad season and they haven't got enough wheat, put the bloody unemployed males in the army, give them a bit of training and send them across the border to steal somebody else's land and resources. It's been happening since the Yamnayans 6,000 years ago, and they started in Ukraine. But of course, the particular grade of intellectual lowlife and cretin that Donald Trump surrounds himself with, the empty-headed sycophants who just want to cheer whatever the dear leader says, none of them put any fucking thought at all whatsoever into the likely downstream consequences of them attacking Iran and Iran saying, okay, bring it on. They all expected Iran to surrender within a week, because they'd been patting themselves on the head and telling themselves fairy stories, more or less ever since George Herbert Walker Bush sent Madeleine Albright to tell Saddam Hussein that the United States does not concern itself with minor internecine border disputes among the America's Arab client states. Saddam Hussein smiled broadly on the television set as I watched him in Australia. So he proceeded to roll across the border of Kuwait. And golly gosh gee darn shucks, everybody in NATO decided that was a terribly wicked idea, and they agreed to go and fire off their entire anti-Soviet stockpile of ammunition and get their bloody engines of all their tanks and aeroplanes worn out with sand in the desert. After which, all of their armament stockpiles were empty, so they had to rearm, didn't they, with new, bright, shiny, improved versions of all the weapons and ammunition and tanks and planes, and bombs and guns. And then 10 years later, George Walker Bush decided that what was good enough for Dad was going to be good enough for him, but what he wanted was a war that didn't stop after a few weeks, so that all of his political donors could continue to make fat profits supplying the military, who was blowing shit up on the battlefield constantly. And that's how we got the Forever War, which worked for 25 years. But it used to be a bloody mystery to me what was going to happen, because all the best and brightest, best educated, most intelligent diplomats and negotiators and generals and admirals and air chief marshals and captains of industry, the very best they'd been able to do was to bring the world to the edge of a catastrophe from global warming and overpopulation and resource depletion and pollution. And yeah, the parliaments had come up with laws to protect the environment, and the lobby groups had done everything they possibly could to bloody circumvent the laws and get around them. And it was fairly clear that the game plan was to grow the economy and make a profit right up until the wheels fell off the environment. And then everybody was going to die, and whoever dies with the most toys wins. And that was the official plan. And everybody sort of knew how to stay in their lane and not to do anything that would break the system. But then Ronald Reagan failed to educate the American population. He cut federal education spending by 25%, and that was in the 1980s. So you've now got 3 consecutive generations of Americans who are literally congenitally stupid. Their fucking grandparents had no education, their parents had no education, and they've got no education. They don't know whether the sun revolves around the earth or whether the earth revolves around the sun, and the moon complicates shit for them entirely. No wonder they believe in astrology. Once upon a time, while he was supposed to have been nailed to a tree and dying, Jesus said, "Forgive them, they know not what they do." Well, on one level you can forgive them, but on another level, feeling sorry for them and understanding why they've done what they've done, that doesn't change the fact that they've fucking done it. They voted for Trump. This is what they wanted. They got what they were after. I hope they fucking enjoy it. They have no right to complain. The people I feel sorry for are the Americans who voted against Trump. The ones who really deserve to become roadkill are the sleazy fucking arseholes who couldn't be bothered getting up off their arse to vote against him or vote for him, because they just didn't have any opinion they wanted to express. Therefore they have absolutely no right to complain about whatever happens, because they just did not fucking care. But the fact of the matter is, the world runs on free will, as enforced by whoever gets to make the decision first. If you want to be a concentration camp guard, then I have to be fucking Anne Frank in bloody Auschwitz. People who want to do terribly selfish, horrible things require innocent victims. The faith comes in where you postulate that some system exists so that due compensation is made for the people who get stuck with being some other arsehole's innocent victim. In the long run, selfish arseholes always get their just desserts. And apparently everybody dies when they're at their spiritual peak, when there are no more options available to them, where they can choose to do something that's going to either lead them closer toward the light or make the world a slightly better place. However slightly better. If all of your options have been wiped out by somebody else exercising their freedom of will, yeah, you can find yourself being utterly fucked. No options. All your choices are bad, and then you get taken off the playing board and you die as an innocent victim, so hopefully you get a fucking star on your forehead in the afterlife or something. But basically it appears that there's a competition going on between fearfulness and faithfulness. Anybody who's watched how the world works and noticed that the observed incidents of benevolent coincidence and synchronicity and serendipity is orders of magnitude above that which would be predicted if you were living in a universe of random, cascading, chaotic chance. Once you accept the fact that there is something going on, the universe is biased in favour of life and good outcomes, fair outcomes. Yes, there are selfish individuals who choose to fuck shit up for those around them because they're trying to harvest everything and get everything they can, presumably because for 12,000 years they come from a line of individuals whose umpty-ump great ancestor was terrified of starvation, and it's warped and twisted that whole fucking tribe, and they've stolen the whole planet. But at some point, the apparent short-term success of being a selfish arsehole has got to run out of resources to steal. And I think when the Americans get to the bottom of their terminal high-altitude aerial defence munitions and they run out of Patriots, the missiles $4 million each, and they run out of Tomahawks at $2 million each, I think that's when they're going to find an awful lot of difficulty in getting anybody to cooperate with doing anything that Uncle Spam thinks needs to happen. I don't know how long it's going to take for planet Earth's human population to sort itself out and stabilise again. I don't know how much culture anybody's going to manage to retain, because global warming's not slowing down, it's all going to get worse. What we're doing at the moment is destroying humanity's resilience and ability to organise itself to survive in the face of record-breaking, increasingly intense, increasingly extreme, intense weather events. Like, yeah, it's great being brave in the face of a bushfire when you got aerial firefighting and fire trucks and hoses, and that's great. When all you got's a fucking solar-powered motorbike and no fuel for the pump, it all gets a bit different. And any of these poor bastards who are trying to make a living out of raising sheep and cattle and selling them, they have no time to be out there preparing to defend against a bushfire. The bottom line appears to be that our grandparents ate our play lunch 40 fucking years ago. Maybe 50 or 60 years ago. Like, President Eisenhower was told about anthropogenic global warming and greenhouse effect and burning fossil fuel, and he started the National Atmospheric Oceanic Administration, or agency, whatever it is. Bloody Donald Trump's administration's been cutting funding to them because they don't want there to be any scientists doing any research, because if there's no research, there's no data, and if there's no data, there's no proof that any problem exists, so they can continue to go ahead trying to make a profit doing whatever the fuck they want, and if it upsets the environment, they don't care. None of the idiotic arseholes who are propagating the idea of artificial intelligence and robot operated society, none of them have any idea where the customer base is going to get their money to buy anything from, because none of their customers are going to have a job. They're all going to be unemployed because of the robots and the artificial intelligence. 45 kilometres, 39 kilometres an hour coming up this hill. Still got 45% of a battery left. So drop your speed 20 kilometres an hour and you get roughly an extra 10-15 kilometres worth of range. My trip to town is normally 33 to 35 kilometres. I do it at 65 k's on the highway, that's 20 kilometres of it. And I normally get home, assuming a light breeze, on 35% of a battery. I'd say I might even get home on 35%, and it'll be, like I said, a 50 kilometre ride. Gotta say, this thing is not particularly comfortable for this amount of time at this speed. What is that sheep doing there? A sheep escaped from the farm. It's therefore a feral sheep. And by rights it should be put down, but that's not what's going to happen in today's Australia. When you consider access to sacred sites on private land, the sheep have got more rights than an Aborigine. Look it up. Sad but true. You can let your sheep graze around a sacred site, but the local traditional owners are not allowed on the property unless they got the landowner's permission. The landowner doesn't need the permission of the traditional owners to let the sheep graze and shit all around the sacred site. Therefore, thus and because, sheep have more rights than Aborigines in Australia. But that won't last long. Once we cope with bloody global warming's increased fire intensity and Donald Trump's fossil fuel crisis, which means that we're going to have fuck all fuel for the fire trucks, and aerial firefighting is probably going to become a thing of the past. We won't be able to protect the fences, and that means that all the graziers are going to have to learn how to farm without fences. And once you don't have to protect the fences, then you're able to return Australia to a traditional burning regime, where you burn the country when it needs to be burnt, regardless of anybody's fucking fantasy plans on feeding all the bushfire fuel to a grazing animal and turning it into meat or wool and then selling the meat and the wool. So change is afoot. And I think America is going to have a really, really horrible summer, marking 250th anniversary of their independence declaration. I suppose a lot depends on how much of their military throws their lot in with the people in ICE who are going to be loyal to Stephen Miller's orders. Very difficult to figure out, because I have no experience of living in a civilization or a society that's as pig ignorant as America is at the moment. It's not merely that they don't know what to think, they don't know how to think. Just observing my neighbour's fencing. I wonder if the cost of diesel will prevent him from continuing his fencing project. It'd be interesting to see what happened if the price of diesel went up to $10 or $15 a litre. 6 weeks ago when I rode this thing to town, it would save 3.5 litres, or about $6. Now it saves 3.5 litres and it's about $8.50. And I wonder how today's population will behave in the face of a fuel shortage, where they get told, you know, half of you can't take your car to a service station if it's an odd numbered day of the week and you've got an even number plate on your car. That was a thing they did in the early 70s. When OPEC refused to sell crude oil to America and Europe until America and Europe told Israel to back off and stop its invasion of Egypt. After which a bloke called Nixon managed to get OPEC to agree to only sell oil for American dollars and have America provide for the military security of all of their oil fields, thus artificially propping up the value of the American dollar, which was otherwise bankrupt after Nixon took the country off the gold standard and the Vietnam War bankrupted their economy. So I'm afraid we've all been living on borrowed time since I was in high school. And it's been a prosperous time. And I have been guilty of enjoying the fine life, at least until I was, I don't know, maybe 25. Back then I couldn't see any reason why they weren't going to have a nuclear World War III by the middle of the 80s, and I decided to have a go at surviving that. So I went bush to prepare for the end of the world, and the end of the world took 40 fucking years to get around to arriving at this particular spot where it's at now. And I still reckon I got the best end of the deal. I reckon the people I went to school with who are on their third mortgage and their fourth broken marriage and their fifth Brady bunch, living in the suburbs, I think they can keep it. I hope they enjoy it when the grid falls down and all their money evaporates when there's no more digital storage for the bank's computer. It's what they voted for. It's what they voted for every time they opened their wallet and chose to buy something that required cheap oil, cheap electricity. I'm really glad I've never been overseas, never went on a clap-catching expedition to Bali, never went globe-trotting to Europe or America, never went on a backpack tour of Bhutan. Would have been fun. And to be honest, the only reason I did not go to Bhutan was because I hurt me back nursing and had to give up working, and therefore I didn't have the money and I didn't have the back to carry the backpack. But yeah, there was a time when I was convinced I was going to do that. Now I'm glad I didn't, because I would not want the guilt trip of having sat in a jet-powered aeroplane to go away for a holiday. It's one little piece of decadence for which I am not responsible. And I have no idea how long YouTube will continue uploading as American civilization disappears up its own cloaca. But my game plan is to keep on keeping on for as long as possible. And my theory is, if there are two individuals and one individual is being aggressive to the other individual, then it's pretty easy for the universal creator God theory to see who the violent arsehole is and, I don't know, maybe hit them with a bolt of lightning or something, make their life turn to shit afterwards, you know, get even with them. If some violent arsehole starts attacking somebody else and the victim tries to fight back, then from the point of view of a universal creator God theory, all you can see is two violently selfish, fearful arseholes fighting with each other over who's got the most faithless view of the God theory. So yeah, if I was that God theory, I'd sit back and let them fight with each other. It's only by taking skin off each other that they're going to wake up to themselves. If they're not prepared to read or listen or look or think about shit, you might as well sit back and just let them hurt themselves. Eventually they'll wake up to themselves when they get sick of it. At least that's the theory. Might be right, might be wrong, I don't know. But anyway, 52 kilometres, 34% of a battery remaining. 1 hour and 18 minutes, average speed of 40 kilometres an hour, maximum speed of 81. Do you remember 81? I don't remember 81. I imagine 81 kilometres an hour must have been when we went over a bump and there was some throttle on and the back wheel accelerated to 81 kilometres an hour before it came back down and hit the bitumen and sanded some of the rubber off the tyre. I think that's what's going on. Anyway, warbles on a lot to YouTube. Here endeth the 27th version of the Trumpocalypse Chronicles. I might not be the gyro captain in a Mad Max movie, but I have got an ultralight in the trailer. Broken, but it's there. And if you have to live through a Mad Max style of an apocalypse, this ain't such a bad place. And that's a fairly nice little stand in for a gyrocopter in an apocalypse. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.